Well, it's probably the verse you're thinking of, but probably not for the reason you're thinking of. Well, hi there, my name is Chris, welcome to Mudwalkers. If you haven't already become a Patreon member, check out the link in the description. It'd be super helpful if you could support me financially. Otherwise, just check it out. Clicking on the link is free. But, yeah, my favorite Bible verse is Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Now, you may think that the reason I like that verse so much is because it's about being naked and unashamed, so we don't have to wear clothes. But it's my favorite verse for that reason, of course, but also for a much more important, deeper reason as well. And that's that the concept of nakedness was complicated in ancient Hebrew, both linguistically and culturally. The idea of being naked, yes, it meant that you weren't wearing any clothes at that time, but it also meant that you were destitute. You didn't own anything, because your clothes would be the last thing that you would want to sell because it was your basic protection against cold and against abrasion, things like that. And if you were that desperate to sell your clothes, something had gone terribly wrong, which meant that you had been mistreated, abandoned, neglected by your clan, your tribe, and why would they do that unless you were a terrible person? Or worse, you had been abandoned, neglected, or abused by the gods or by Yahweh himself, depending on the culture we're talking about. And so being naked had that stigma attached to it as well. Okay, apparently even the gods don't like you, so why should I care about you? So it was a terrible state of dishonor to be perpetually naked, to not own clothing. That was dishonor. That wasn't cool. You didn't do that. And then also, you see the concept of nakedness come up later on in Genesis, right? When Joseph, the son of Jacob, goes into Egypt, he becomes a great leader there. And then his brothers show up and he accuses them of being military spies. And what does he tell them? You've only come here to spy out the nakedness of the land. Okay, well in Hebrew it does say nakedness. But what he's talking about is military vulnerabilities. You come out to find the chinks in our armor. You've come out here to find the gaps in our borders where you can come in here with an army and steal all of our food. See, there was a big food shortage at the time. And he thought, he claimed to think that they were only there to figure out how to steal the grain with an army. And he said, oh, no, you're not going to try that. And so he ended up throwing them in prison. But, and that's a whole complicated story. Go read the last, 10, 15 chapters of Genesis. It's a beautiful, wonderful story. But, yeah, so the concept of nakedness overall was this whole tapestry of concepts, right? It wasn't just being unclothed. So it's very interesting then that's the reason why the author of Genesis can't just say, and Adam and Eve were naked. Full stop, on to the next story. He can't say that because he has to express to his readers at the time that them being naked was not a bad thing. Yes, they were destitute, but they were not ashamed of being destitute. They were destitute, but it was okay. It wasn't a state of dishonor. Yes, they were vulnerable, but vulnerable to what? They were fine. And they hadn't been abused or neglected by the gods or by Yahweh. They were exactly what they were supposed to be, and where they were supposed to be, and how they were supposed to be. So when he says, the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed, Moses, or whoever wrote Genesis, I think it was probably Moses is going out of his way to express that this nakedness was good, as opposed to what the assumptions would have been in the culture at the time. The tent's falling over again. But he has to go out of his way to tell them this. Now, why wasn't their nakedness a problem? Right? Why wasn't their destitution a problem? Why wasn't their vulnerability a problem? Why wasn't their poverty a problem? Essentially, they owned nothing. But they had one thing. You can probably guess what it was, or who it was. That's Yahweh, God, the Lord. They had Yahweh, and that was enough. Where did the earth itself come from? Well, from Yahweh. Where did the water come from they were going to drink? It came from Yahweh. Where did the food they were going to eat come from? It came from Yahweh. If their relationship with Yahweh was whole and good and perfect, the rest of their life was going to be like that. So, to be naked and unashamed in Yahweh's presence means... Okay, break time's over. So, the reason why Moses, or whoever wrote Genesis, had to go out of his way and say this is because of all of these cultural meanings behind nakedness at the time. So, what we end up with is a very clear proclamation that the nakedness in Eden was not a bad thing. But he kind of had to say that, right, explicitly, because he had to say it explicitly because of the cultural attitudes of his time. So, what we're looking at is their destitution wasn't a bad thing, because is that a bird? Anyway, it wasn't a bad thing. Because they had Yahweh, right? Because they had God. And he ultimately would provide everything else. So, that's become my attitude. It's kind of become my anthem. Is naked and unashamed. Not because, not merely because of, the nakedness aspect of it, but that there's so much more to it. It's deeper than that. I want to be naked and unashamed before God. I want him to be enough in my life. He is enough for me. And I hope he's enough for you. He's better than anything and everything else in our lives. He's the great light of my life. My life wouldn't be right without him, and he makes everything else right. And everything else that he's not doing right this second to make my life perfect, he'll do eventually. That's what the resurrection is for. That's what the new heavens and new earth is for. After all of this is over, we get the new heavens and the new earth and the resurrection. After this, I'm basically going to be rambling, so let's do the Patreon shout out. This episode of Mudwalkers has been brought to you by my generous supporters on Patreon. Shout out to Nature Him, Todd, Edward, John S., Joseph, Charlie, Lionheart, Adam, Edward T., Cyan, John W., Clifton, Trev, None Here, Alan M., Marty, Austin, Martin C., Sup, Benjamin, Queerbo, Tony S., and Randy L. Thank you guys so much for everything you're doing on Patreon. You guys are making this channel possible. You're making my work sustainable. And I probably would not be out here having this amazing time on the river if it wasn't for you guys. So, really, thank you. If you haven't already checked out my Patreon link, it's in the description below. It's free to click on it. And we have a $5 option and we have a $10 option. Both options get early access to all of my content that I'm able to upload early, which is almost all of it. And the $10 option also gets access to a monthly video call with me and the other $10 patrons. That's a great time for us to hang out and swap stories and share ideas, and I love that. It's a highlight of every month, getting to sit down and have a conversation with my patrons. There are a few people who tend to talk more than the rest, especially me, and there are a few people who talk less, but everyone gets to talk, everyone gets to share stories, and it's a gust of wind. And I'm grateful for the chance to talk to all of you. With that, I'm going to end the video here as the wind picks up, and I will see you in the next one.